Stage 2 of the CDL pre-trip is engine compartment area, front driver's side axle, including steering components. So here we are at the rear of this vehicle. Obviously this is a rear engine. You would still be at the front if it was front engined, obviously. So the first thing I'm going to do here is engine compartment area. You could ask the examiner at any time to repeat the instructions when you feel you're getting lost. Or if the examiner sees that you may be getting lost, they should be able to repeat the instructions for you. Because we have a lot to remember. Engine compartment, front driver's side axle, including steering items. So from here, well, I'm going to first check the tension on this door because there's no lock on this rear door. So I have to make sure that it's not going to spring open as I'm driving down the road. So I check that tension, that's fine. So here's my engine bay, and what I'm looking for is anything that may be unusual. I'm looking for items that can prevent a breakdown or be safety related items. First, in this corner over here on this vehicle, which is a Gillig with a Cummins diesel engine, I have two gauges I should be concerned about. I have a temperature gauge and an oil pressure gauge. Temperature gauge is the one at the top, oil pressure gauge is below it. Obviously the oil pressure gauge is showing quite low because the vehicle's not running, and the temperature gauge is showing about right because we've been running it for a little while. So about 240 is about right on the temperature gauge. And you do have idiot lights above the driver's seat, or warning lights, sorry, above the driver's seat that will let you know if you have a problem with temperature or oil pressure. So what we can do now is open up this panel so we can have a good look at the engine, because I want to inspect things like serpentine belts, alternator, water pump, air compressor, things like that. Now these usually have a key, but oftentimes a screwdriver works just as well. So here, as we look at this engine compartment area, like I said, a general overview. I'm looking for things like wiring that may be loose or hanging, or look like they may not be attached where they should be attached. Up here we have our alternator. This alternator we want to check to make sure our wires going to and from the alternator are properly attached. The alternator itself firmly attached to the engine, and the belt on this length of belt shouldn't have more than 3/4 of an inch of slack. Shouldn't be able to turn it more than a half a turn. And I'm checking the belt for splits and frays, tears, and even things like oil and stuff on that belt that could cause it to slip and to squeal. If I want to find my water pump, I follow my coolant hoses. They'll take me down to the water pump, which is attached to the engine here, but is driven off of a belt as well. So as I look at the water pump down here, you may be able to see it if you sneak a look down the side there, although it is dark. The water pump, trust me, is attached to the engine over there. It's not leaking, obviously, otherwise I would see a pool of fluid beneath the engine bay. And the hoses that go to and from that water pump appear to be properly mounted, and that is also driven by a serpentine belt, just like the alternator. And I need to check that that belt is in good condition in the same way. It's not frayed, torn, loose, covered in something like oil, and doesn't have more than 3/4 of an inch of deflection. If we look for the air compressor, my air compressor on this engine is gear driven. It's attached to the engine. It's down in this area down here. Remember, our CDL instructions are to point to, touch or demonstrate. So if you point to your air compressor, point out that it's properly mounted. I know it's not leaking. I don't hear any leaks from the air compressor, and that, like I said, is driven by gear. In the back behind, this is an air conditioner unit, but in behind the air conditioner unit we have a fluid reservoir for hydraulic fluid, which is our power steering fluid. That power steering fluid I need to make sure isn't leaking, so if I have a quick look under the vehicle, I don't see any leaks from either my power steering fluid or my coolant, water pump. I don't see any leaks either from my transmission fluid or my engine oil. So all of my fluids appear to be not leaking or empty, but we'll check them in just a minute. The power steering box on this vehicle is under the front. You can't see it from here, so we'll get to that when we look at the front of the vehicle again, at the front axle. As I move along, still quickly checking hoses, clamps, wiring. I'm going to close this over again just a second so that I can check my coolant hoses here that go to the coolant reservoir. My reservoir is up here, and if I give that a bit of a wipe down, I can see there's coolant in that top lens, which indicates to me that we're full of coolant. If I could see daylight in the bottom lens, then I would need to fill that up. My engine oil is on a dipstick, and we pull it out. Oh, let's get the right dipstick, that's my transmission fluid. We pull it out, the engine oil's on the braided dipstick. I know you mechanics are laughing at me now, huh? And we want to check that it's at the full level, so you wipe it off, we'll put it back in, and we should see engine oil in that area. And if I do that, make sure you put it all the way in, pull it out, you see, plenty of engine oil. Transmission fluid for some reason is not part of the CDL pre-trip, so I don't need to bother pulling that one out. Again, still checking hoses to make sure that clamps are intact. Hoses aren't leaking, they're pliable and mounted where they should be mounted. One thing we can check back here as well that most vehicles have running underneath them is my exhaust system. And if we look in here, I can see an exhaust system. It looks like a huge trombone winding its way around the engine compartment area. That exhaust system I'm checking to make sure I don't see any signs of leaks, which would be things like soot trails, or even some fluid condensation leaking out of the exhaust system. I don't see any of that. The exhaust system appears to be properly mounted with the U-bolts and the straps and hangers that they use to mount it. And when I fire the vehicle up, I would also be listening for an unusual tone from my exhaust that would indicate that it may have a hole or a leak. And that is pretty much my engine bay area. So I can lock this down now. And again, confirm that your door closes. And if we remember the next set of instructions that were part of that set, front driver side axle and steering components. We've already talked about the steering reservoir, power steering reservoir. The hoses that go to and from that obviously aren't leaking, we didn't see any leaks. So as we go towards the front of the bus, my steering components on a bus like this are unusual because instead of going from the rear to the front tyres, this goes from the front back to the front tyres, because your steering area, your driver's seat is obviously in front of the steering axle. So my steering components would be underneath this area. So what I would be checking is things like power steering hoses. I can't really see them in that area because everything is covered by a nice steel plate. But I would be checking power steering hoses to make sure that they're not leaking as they go towards the steering box. The steering box is firmly mounted, and a good indicator that we know that is there is no fluid leaks under there. My steering mechanism, I would be checking things like drag link and pitman arm to make sure they're straight, they're not cracked or broken, no unusual welds, and that they're firmly mounted, and the bolts and the split pins or cotter pins that hold those in place are where they should be. That brings us then to the front axle. So for just a second, I want to stand here quietly and listen. What I'm listening for is leaks. I know I've got air. My air pressure is at about 65 right now. So if I had any leaks from my air brake system or from my airbag suspension, I would be able to hear them from here. And I don't hear any leaks at all, so that indicates that the air lines going to my brakes and my airbags are in reasonable condition. Now, I need to also, but I can't see on this vehicle the way it sits heavily on its axle, I would also want to be looking beyond here to see that my air lines are properly mounted, although like I said I can't tell that from here. I want to make sure that my airbags have proper mounts, the mounting bolts are in place. These do have shock absorbers on the front and rear with the airbags, so those shouldn't be leaking. They should be properly mounted. The bolts that hold those in place are where they should be, and I don't see any problem with that. As we come forward a little bit, we're looking here at our drum brakes. I want to make sure, I can see the outside of the drum here, I want to make sure that that's not cracked or broken. I don't see any dodgy welds as I look through the wheel to my drum. I can't see the brake shoes, but there must be at least quarter of an inch on those brake shoes so that we have adequate material to bring us to a stop. I need to be making sure that my slack adjuster and push rod with my brakes off and with my parking brake off shouldn't be able to pull it more than a quarter of an inch, and they should be at 90-degree angles to each other. And the brake shoes shouldn't be covered with any debris, and that would be stuff like sand or oil or even water that could affect the braking ability of the vehicle. When I get to the tyre here, I want to make sure on the front wheel I have at least 430 seconds of tread. No recaps on the front tyre is allowed, so I have no recaps. I'm checking the tread all the way across to make sure it's even. I check the sidewalls to make sure I don't have any splits or cracks or bulges, and I look at these little dimples on the sidewalls, which are like wear bars, that would tell me if that tyre needed to be changed because of excessive wear on the sidewall. I check that the tyre and the wheel are meeting each other correctly. There's no big gaps between the tyre and the rim. There's no dents or damage to the rim and no non-factory welds on this wheel. Right here I have my my valve. It does have a stem cover on it with a little ball that will allow me to still check the tyre pressures, and I'm looking on cold tyres on this vehicle at around 105, 110 psi, and that's roughly what I was getting there. As I calm down, I need to check my nuts in the morning, so I look at my lug nuts to make sure I don't see any shiny areas on threads. I'm looking to make sure I don't see any rust coming out from behind these threads that would indicate moisture is getting behind this collar and forcing rust out. Any threads that are much shorter than the others would indicate that one is loose, and I don't see any signs of loose lug nuts, or even a hole that was not round but egg-shaped would indicate that the wheel is moving on that lug nut. As I get to the middle, to the hub, check the nuts around the hub here, check the hub seal to make sure there is no leaks from that hub seal, and I would see evidence of fluid all the way around here if there was. And some of them have a little fill, a lens in here so you can look at it to see where the fill mark is, but on this one we don't. And that, unless I'm mistaken, is my front axle and steering components.